Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 31. Now that World War II is over, we're going to talk about the aftermath. Welcome to the Cold War. The Cold War, as you can see here, is what we use to refer to the war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So, for those of you who don't remember, the Soviet Union is communist Russia, now that the Soviets have taken over. And this is a 45-year war between capitalism and communism from 1945 to 1990, when the United States and the Soviet Union were at odds with each other. But it's called a Cold War because actually no one actually ever fought each other. The United States and the Soviet Union never went to war with each other. Instead, what we did is we fought a series of proxy wars. A proxy war, think of a proxy war as two people playing chess. The United States and the Soviet Union were playing chess together, and all the other little countries in the world are the chessmen on the chessboard. And we use those little pawns to go to war with each other on our behalf. So, the next slide, you can see here on the right the map of Europe after World War II. Now, this here, Germany, you can see the Allied armies from the West had overrun these nations as they were defeating the Germans, and the Soviet armies got to all of these areas here. And now the agreement was made among the big three that at the end of the war, that it would be allowed that all of the original countries that existed at the beginning of World War II in 1939, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Austria, that basically they would be allowed to become self-determined nations again. Well, when World War II came to an end, Joseph Stalin changed his mind and decided he's going to keep all of this. His armies are already here, so this land now belongs to him. His excuse was he needs it as a buffer zone so that future invasions would not happen. Of course, that violation caused immediate paranoia in the United States, especially because remember, it was both the United States and the Soviet Union who came out of World War II as the superpowers. So this decision made by Joseph Stalin to keep everything his armies possessed at the end of World War II, here and even in Asia, you'll see shortly, caused alarm in the United States. And the president at the time, Harry Truman, created the Truman Doctrine, which basically was the new policy will be that the United States will take certain steps to prevent the takeover of countries that have been weakened by World War II by the communists. Because now that the Soviets are so strong, they're sending money into these other countries, even in Europe, and Greece especially was the first place this happened, to fund the communist parties so that the communist parties can grow in power and take over. And Stalin was even telling the whole world that communism and the Soviet Union were going to dominate the whole planet. So in order to stop the spread of communism, of course, the United States and her allies would need to rebuild all of the countries that had been so devastated by World War II, so everyone has jobs, everybody has foods, and etc. So the way we did it for Western Europe is through what was called the Marshall Plan. And that's basically $13 billion was spent by the United States, given to all of the countries that had been damaged by World War II here, to help them rebuild their infrastructure and their factories and things like that to get their economies on track. And to be honest, it worked. None of the countries would fall to communism. Ultimately, the policy of the Truman Doctrine will evolve over time. Remember, this is a 45-year war, to a policy that is called containment. Basically, the United States decided the countries that the Soviet Union already had within their grasp, well, we're not going to go to war for those countries. We're not going to have our boys and girls go out and be killed anymore. We just had that big long World War II. And by 1948, even the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. Their spies actually stole the blueprints to the American atomic bomb and snuck the blueprints to the bomb back to the Soviet Union, where they got that information and built their own bomb. So 3 years after World War II, basically the Soviet Union is a nuclear power also. Now, the reason we decided we're not going to save those people, obviously we want to save our own lives and avoid nuclear war, is because we're not going to let it spread. Wherever they try to spread, though, we will fight. We will interfere because of what we refer to as the domino theory. And this is a theory that if we allow another country to fall to communism, the one next to it will also fall, just like a domino, like the roll of dominoes. When one falls, it knocks the next one over. So our policy of containment was based on a domino theory that if we allow one country to fail, to fall to communism, then more will follow. So everything we've done since then is based on that. The Germans themselves, as I mentioned previously, as was agreed by the Allies, Germany was divided into 4 zones. Basically, you had the Soviet sector here, and the capital city was also divided into 4. I'll talk about that in a second. But the capital city, you need to remember, is inside the Soviet sector. So inside the part that belonged to the Soviet Union, the British, the French, and the Americans also had each a quarter of the city of Berlin here. But then you have your British section, your American section, and your French sections over here of Germany. And the plan was that we would work together to rebuild Germany because we learned the lessons from World War I about the destruction of war, and if we have punishments and reparations and things like that, that it could just cause another war. We learned our lessons, at least the Western Allies did. And we began working together, the three allies over here, Brits, French, and the Americans, of rebuilding Germany. The Soviets, though, they had different plans. They basically punished the Germans and everyone else in Europe over here and forced them to pay reparations to the Soviet Union. They stole all of not only the art and things of values from Eastern Europe, but like even all the heavy machines in the factories and stuff like that. They hundreds of trainloads full of the machinery were sent back to the Soviet Union in order to build up their industrial complex. But as I mentioned, Berlin too is divided into 4 sections. So the city of Berlin itself, you have Eastern Berlin, which belongs to the Soviet Union, and then you have Western Berlin, which was divided into 3 sections here belonging to the other 3 allies. Okay, so what it looks like on a map, you can see here, East Germany, which will become the communist nation in the future, belonging to the Soviet Union, with the city of Berlin here divided also, and the other 3 sectors, zones over here. Each place had a corridor. So there was roads that we can send trucks and trains full of food and other supplies to the people living in our part of the city, because the Soviets aren't taking care of them. We have to take care of them to keep them alive and going. And the Soviets, of course, took care of their own. Now, as we had agreed previously, the Allies by 1948 were ready to reunite Germany. And the Soviets said no, they're not going to do it. So we decided to reunite our 3 sections into a country by itself. And this is how the country of West Germany was born. That's why I mentioned earlier that this will become a country of East Germany, because the Russians kept it and never let it go back to Germany. So during the Cold War, you have West Germany and then you have East Germany. But the Soviets got angry about the reunification of these 3 zones into Germany, and they decided to block the roads to West Germany. Their idea was that they blocked the passage of the trains and trucks of supplies to Berlin, these people will all starve to death, and soon they will have to beg to come over to the Soviet side. So how did the Allies respond to that? Basically, this is what happened. The Berlin airlift. Obviously, our roads couldn't be used because if we trashed their borders and stuff like that, that could be an act of war. But we have airplanes. And there was also air corridors to the airport in West Berlin that our planes could fly. And if the Russians shot down our plane, that would be an act of war too. And the Russians were trying to avoid war also. So we were able, for 10 months, to supply West Berlin through what we call the Berlin Airlift. Okay, we flew 550,000 flights of airplanes full of food and other supplies, almost 2.5 million tons of food and other supplies to keep the people alive over there over the course of 10 months. And after 10 months, the Soviets saw that their plan to win West Berlin had failed, so they finally lifted their blockade, and we were able to once again to begin supplying by trucks and trains. But what's important about the Berlin airlift is it demonstrated to the Germans in West Berlin that we were not going to abandon them, that we were going to defend their freedom. Okay? During the 10 months, we also begin to see the Germans as friends, as allies, that the new enemy, in fact, indeed, were the communists. Now, here is a little video down here. It's about a 9-minute video. I am going to give you 5 points on your chapter quiz if you watch this video and send me a little message telling me about the candy bomber and what the candy bomber did that, for the people of West Berlin during the Berlin airlift. If you send me a middle message, tell me in 4 sentences about the candy bomber, I'll add 5 points to your end of the chapter quiz. Another thing that happened, now this is about a decade later, for the Soviets trying to establish greater control over the people in the East. One of the problems that the Soviet Union encountered since we had those corridors to West Berlin is hundreds of thousands of people in Europe, Eastern Europe, would go to Berlin and get in trucks and cars and hide and sneak out to escape for freedom into the West. And as a result, the Berlin Wall was built. Basically, the Soviet Union built a giant wall separating East and West Berlin from each other, making it look like a prison. I mean, here's what it looks like. I mean, there's the kill zone. You have guard towers and stuff like that. And anyone trying to escape from the communism to freedom, they would literally shoot you down with machine guns. It's like you were in a prison. Okay? And basically, the famous Iron Curtain speech was made by Winston Churchill at that time when he mentioned that all of Eastern Europe had been stemmed in with steel, guns, etc., to make them remain prisoners to communism. Something important that happened at the time, too, is the formation of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where the United States joined into a defensive alliance with all of the countries of Western Europe to protect them in a defense agreement from Soviet aggression. Of course, that made the Soviets nervous, so they did the same thing with the countries that they had kept after World War II, creating their own defensive alliance called the Warsaw Pact. That's what those two terms refer to. Arms race. Now, of course, with the two superpowers staring at each other all the time, there's going to be a race between the Soviet Union and the United States to build up as many weapons, nuclear weapons especially, as possible. The more weapons, the more our enemy would be frightened to go to war against us. That is the concept. The concept is referred to as deterrence. Okay? By holding huge arsenals of nuclear weapons, it will prevent a war because we will each believe that neither of us have enough weapons that we could destroy the enemy before the enemy could launch their weapons back. And that concept is based on the acronym of MAD, M-A-D, which literally stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. If one side starts the war by launching their missiles trying to wipe out the other side real fast, the other side has so many missiles that it's impossible to get them all, and we will actually be able to fire our missiles back and destroy them too. So we will all both die if anyone starts the war. Now, speaking of missiles, the United States system is called Triad. We do have the nuclear missiles, but we also have nuclear missiles that can be fired from undersea submarines. And then, of course, we have nuclear bombs and missiles that can be dropped and fired from airplanes. That is the offensive nuclear posturing of Triad. And if you look at this slide here, you can also see in the United States, now this is about a 10-year-old slide here, but basically, I'm sorry, 3-year-old slide, 2017. You can see the number of nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia has. Now, Russia was no longer the Soviet Union by 2017. The other nations of the world who are nuclear powers. And then here you can see how many ballistic missiles the United States has, our nuclear missile submarines, how many of those missiles we have, and etc. So you can actually see the nuclear power here of the United States. And last but not least, I'm not giving you a study guide this time, but for this part of there are 2 parts to the chapter PowerPoints. These are the things you'll need to know from this PowerPoint for your Chapter 31 quiz. So as long as you know what these words mean from what I just mentioned and can answer these 4 questions, you've done very well. And that brings us to an end to part 1. Part 2 will come